Frequency and the Conference of Referential Validity by Hasher, Goldstein, and Topino, published in the Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior in 1977. Towards the middle of the introductions, the authors say this: "It seemed to us that people are willing to make judgments about the truth or falsity of such plausible statements in the absence of certain knowledge. What then could be the basis for such judgments? This is a question not about the contents of semantic memory, nor about the relation among those contents, but rather about the fundamental problem of how our general knowledge, including our certainty about that knowledge, accumulates in the first place." So that's the question they're asking. How does the knowledge get into our mind in the first place? And how do we become so certain that the information is true? So what the idea was that, or the concept or question was, well, it's possible that if you hear the same thing over and over, you might end up believing that it is true, but there wasn't really any data to support that hypothesis. And that's what this study set out to find. The materials and methods. A total of 140 plausible assertions were formed by culling reference works on 10 general topics, including history, government, sports, politics, and so forth. From the total pool of 140 statements, 20 were selected to serve as repeated items by choosing one true and one false statement from each of the 10 categories. The remaining 120 statements were then divided into 3 groups of 40 each, half of which were true and half of which were false. Each of the 3 groups of 40 were then combined with the 20 repeated statements to generate the 3 sets of 60 statements presented to the students for their validity judgments. The subjects were instructed that they would hear statements that might or might not be true, and that each one should be rated on a 7-point scale, with 4 indicating uncertain, 5 indicating possibly true, 6 indicating probably true, and 7 indicating definitely true. And then 3, 2, and 1 were the same, but were false, so possibly, probably, and definitely false. Okay, so that's what they were asked. The subjects, there were 140 college students whose data were used in analyzing the results. So the setting is this. They're asking college students to rate statements from 1 to 7, with 1 being definitely false, 7 being definitely true, and 4 being uncertain. And they're asking them to rate them randomly. Well, they're asking them to rate them, but the assertions are assigned randomly. They're given the test in session 1, and there's true and false statements, and there's repeated and non-repeated statements randomly in that test. And then the same concept was given in session 2, but some of the questions were repeated. Others were not repeated in session 2. So the repeated statements from session 1 stayed the same from session 1 to 2 to 3. And then, of course, the non-repeated statements in session 2 were new, and the non-repeated statements in session 3 were new. And so through that method, they can determine from just the repeated statements whether or not there's a change in the validity judgment on just those repeated statements compared to the statements that were not repeated. And some of the repeated statements were false and some of them were true. Let's look at the results. The results, there's only one table, and I'm going to show it in a graph format. We're looking at the influence of repeated statements on referential validity. With on the x-axis, we have session 1, session 2, and session 3. And on the y-axis, we have the validity judgment assigned by the student on a scale of 1 to 7. We're going to look at true and false statements, whether they were repeated or not repeated. And if we look at the true statements that were not repeated, we don't see much change over time. It started at a little less than 4.5, and it ended at a little less than 4.5 on the validity scale, from session 1 to session 2 to session 3. When we look at false statements that were not repeated, we see a similar trend. They rated them lower. The students rated the false statements lower, which is good to see. But when they were not repeated, we didn't see a change in their validity judgment from session 1 to 2 to 3. When the true statements were repeated, we actually see an increase from session 1 on the validity scale to session 2. And then to session 3 stayed mostly a plateau. But there was an increase in the rating of the validity of the statement. When the statement was false and repeated, we see a similar increase. So whether the statement was true or whether the statement was false, the increase in validity occurred in both sets from session 1 to 2 to 3. Whereas when it was not repeated, there was no increase in the judgment of the students in terms of the assertion's validity. So when we go back to the paper, we'll see that the validity ratings assigned to repeated items increased across successive tests, while the validity ratings assigned to non-repeated statements did not change. It is important to note that during the first session, there was no difference in the ratings assigned to those statements that would later recur in session 2 and 3, and the ratings assigned to those statements that would not reoccur. Thus, repeated statements are more likely to be judged as true than are similar non-repeated statements. So if you saw on the graph, if the false statement was repeated in the second and third session, they judged those statements to be more valid than true statements that were not repeated. The present research has demonstrated that the repetition of a plausible statement increases a person's belief in the referential validity or truth of that statement. And it's regardless of whether or not it's true or false. And it's regardless of the content. So the category of knowledge didn't have an effect on the increase in validity of a statement if you heard it repeated over and over. In the present experiment, the subject's judgment and repeated statements were more probably true than non-repeated statements occurred in a situation in which there were no verifying information available concerning the actual truth or falsity of the statement. Frequency then must have served as a criterion of certitude for our subjects. Indeed, the present experiment appears to lend empirical support to the idea that if people are told something enough, they'll believe it. So whether it was in history or biology or science, the subject didn't matter. Whether the assertion was true or false, it didn't matter. The influence occurred whether the statement was repeated or not repeated. Repeated statements resulted in subjects assigning greater validity than non-repeated statements. If you want the long-form version of this article, I'll post a link to it up here. Thank you.